So, as she said, my name is Vance Crowe, and before I get started, I just wanted to ask one simple question. How many people in this room have heard of the company Monsanto? You laugh now, but it won't be long in the future when you ask this question and people won't raise their hands. And it's funny how stories work that way, how powerful they are, how much influence they have over our lives. When she described that I was the director of millennial engagement for Monsanto, I actually had no intention of ever getting that job. I had no interest at all in Monsanto because I actually didn't come from agriculture. If you heard that biography that was kind of gone through, that sounds like a really well thought out path, but really I was that kid that got done with college and had no idea what I wanted to do, so I bounced around. I was a deckhand on an eco-tourism ship. I joined the US Peace Corps. I was in public radio. I ended up going to work for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And then when I moved to St. Louis, I started my own company. And this was going along really well for a couple of years, and until one day I got an invitation to go interview at Monsanto to be their director of millennial engagement, and I thought this was hilarious, right? Because if there's one thing that all of those groups that I talked about that I was a part of had in common, it is that everyone knew that Monsanto was evil. So I decided that I was going to take the job interview because, you know, who doesn't want to see inside of North Korea, right? And so I end up taking this interview, and I drive up to the campus of Monsanto. I'm not sure how many of you have ever been to the campus of Monsanto, but in my mind, what I was imagining was that I was going to pull up to this building, and it was going to be 80 stories tall, and there were going to be dark storm clouds around it, and everybody would be wearing black suits and Matrix-style sunglasses, right? And so I was horribly disappointed when I get there, and it's really just like a 2-story college campus with a fountain, and the woman that was greeting me, that was going to run these interviews, had a ponytail and was wearing a sweater, and her name was Holly, right? This just like didn't make sense at all. But so we go in to do the interviews, and the interviews are fascinating because it's actually 7 hours of interviews. And I don't know if any of you in here have ever interviewed for a job that you don't want. That is about as much fun as you can have, right? Because you can say anything you want and it doesn't matter. So the whole time when I'm going through this battery of interviews, every time they'd ask me a question like, what's your preferred management style? And I'd answer that question, then I'd be like, why are you poisoning the world with GMOs? Or why is it that Indian farmers are killing themselves because of your putting them in debt? Right? These were questions I genuinely was asking them because I thought, this is my one chance to ever ask this place that everyone I know has heard these stories about. And so I go all the way through this battery of interviews. Every hour they would bring in 3 or 4 new people for me to berate and kind of push on. And then we get all the way done with the interviews, and they leave, and Holly comes back in the room. And she sits across the table from me, and we're wrapping up, and she says, okay, now that we're done with this battery of interviews, do you have any questions for me? And I got kind of a grin on my face, and I was like, yeah. You're hiring this director of millennial engagement. This person's job is to go out and talk with people that literally believe that Monsanto is evil. How are you going to train a person to do this job? And what she said next changed my life. Because what she said next was, you know, whoever we hire for this job, we're going to train them based on their skill set. And since you've been so curious, I think what I would do is write a list of 50 names of people throughout the company, chemists, breeders, geneticists, farmers, attorneys, communications people, and we'll have you sit down and talk with each one of those people on that list of 50. And when you're done with that list, I want you to sit down with me, and we'll figure out what you do and don't know, and then I'll write another list of 50 people for you to go talk with. And in that moment, a light bulb went off in my head because I realized these people were crazy enough to let me run around and ask anyone anything in this entire company that I want. And so if I discover that everything that they are as evil as everybody says that they are, well then I'll go write the greatest tell-all book of all time. But if they're not, right? If actually something is going on inside of that company that is different than all the stories I'd ever heard up until that point, well, then I had maybe just stumbled upon the most important communications problem in the history of the modern world, which is we're growing food more bountifully than we ever have before in the history of time, and yet people are afraid and even angry about how their food is produced. So all of a sudden I had a new problem. I went from not wanting this job at all to really deeply wanting this job. And then when I get in there, I discover what I'm sure many of you already know. The world of agriculture looked nothing like the stories I had heard. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the stories people are hearing, and really, even more than the stories that people are hearing, I want to talk about the stories that you, as pork producers, should have heard, but maybe because you have your heads down, you're working every day, you've been in this field for so long, maybe you never encountered these stories about where pig production came from in the United States. So I'm going to start off with the whole reason that people go listening to stories, right? The storytelling and the way we listen and hear and seek out stories and decide we're going to spend hours and hours and hours reading a book or completely mesmerized by a movie is because we are designed, everything about ourselves has been communicated through stories. For thousands and thousands of years, humans didn't have a way to pass on information through written form. There were no emails, there weren't libraries. The only way you could pass information from one generation to the next was telling stories. And those stories are often those things that we go searching for. Why am I here? What matters? Who is like me? How am I different? What makes me special? And I think people have this natural drive to go listen and hear and seek out stories. And one of the stories that people have sought out, last night, I was typing into my computer, where does pork come from? It's fascinating. If you type into Google, there is all sorts of really, really good information, right? And it's all about, where pigs come from and how are they raised and who raises them. And then, if you go and look up how are pigs treated, you get a completely different set of stories. Has anybody in here ever seen the movie that comes from this slide? Anybody know what this is? This, about 15 years ago, was put out onto YouTube, back when YouTube was just beginning, and it was seen by 15 million people in the first 2 weeks, which was unheard of. This was incredible. And this is called The Matrix. Now, The Matrix is a very funny play on the story of The Matrix, right? Where the hero, Neo, finds out that he can either keep living in this dream world that he's been in, or he can take the red pill and he can have the world revealed to him. He can find out what's really going on behind the curtain. And in this Matrix story, it's actually pretty interesting, because what they do is they find this pig that's living on a bucolic farm with red barns and everything's perfect, and then he meets Morpheus, the guy in the black trench coat, who I thought all the Monsanto people look like. And Morpheus offers him a chance to get a red pill to find out what's really going on. And as soon as he takes that, then all of a sudden he starts learning about factory farms. Now, why do I bring this up? This will not be a presentation about all these dark stories. This is not going to be one of those. The reason I bring this up is because the way that the creators of this did it, a man named Jonas Sachs is the author of it. The way they created this was they didn't think about telling the story about how they, the activists, the people that are trying to scare you, are so important. What they instead did was they presented a story where you are the pig and they are Morpheus, right? They are allowing you to see behind the curtain. And this type of simple storytelling, even though it was like very basic graphics, went into the cultural consciousness of people, right? It was a very simple story for people to understand that there's something hidden behind the curtain, and that if you only had access, you'd be able to find out how dark and sinister it is. But I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about are the stories that you're comprised of, right? The stories about where you come from and where pig production is all about. And I want to start with where most collections of stories begin, which are origin stories. Where did I come from? And so, oftentimes, When I was out speaking on behalf of Monsanto, I'm the director of millennial engagement, people would stand up during the Q&A and they would walk down the aisle to get to a microphone, and it would be their turn, and they would say, "How do you know GMOs are safe?" Now, to me, and probably to everybody in here, you're probably thinking, well, I know the studies, and I've seen how they're used, and I've talked to the scientists, but it turns out that's not a very effective way to reach people. Because we don't think about our choices logically. We think about them through stories. So what I used to do when somebody would ask that question is I would say, I'm going to answer that question, but first, can I tell you about something that fascinated me that I had never heard of before I came to Monsanto? And they would always say, yeah, go ahead, right? And I would say, I did not know that broccoli didn't grow in the wild. Did you guys know that? Because I didn't, right? I always imagined that there was wild broccoli growing out in the world, and what we did was we went out and collected all the wild broccoli seeds, and then we went and put them in straight lines, and then we started farming them, and that's how we got broccoli. But that's not actually what happened. What actually happened was around 2,600 years ago, there were people that were living in the Mediterranean area, and when they would come along riverbanks, they would find this plant, Brassica oleracea. It was a type of mustard plant. And what they would do is they would say, there's this one with bushy seed pods. All of these plants, they would have bushy seed pods, they'd have these little lateral buds, they'd have these dark green leaves on the side, right? And people loved to encounter this plant because you could eat the whole thing. And so when people discovered that if what they did when they were out collecting these plants was they only picked the ones, they picked the ones with the bushiest seed pods and they held those back. And they went and planted those. And then next year, the only ones that would be around would have bushy seed pods. And if you keep doing that for a few hundred generations, suddenly you have a plant that expresses almost entirely as bushy seed pods, which is broccoli. Now that's interesting, but it's not the most interesting thing. You remember those dark green leaves that I talked about? If you select for those, you get kale. The little lateral buds, select for those a few hundred times, you've developed Brussels sprouts. The root, you get kohlrabi. It goes on and on. All these plants that young people love to hate come from this one terrible Brassica oleracea plant. Now, the reason this story was so impactful was because if a person had really strong feelings about GMOs, but now they have to address the fact that they didn't even know where broccoli came from, suddenly their grip on the story, on the tension, on the fear that they had or the anger that they wanted to bring loosens because you've just given them an experience where they got to learn something totally new. So let's look a little bit about where pigs came from, right? 15,000 years ago, was when we domesticated one of the first animals we ever did. It is no accident that dogs are man's best friend. It's because this was one of the very first animals that we took from the wild, and we were able to get them to breed in captivity, to not bite us or treat us badly, to be able to be trained. And so dogs and humans were around almost alone in the world as companions for about 5,000 years. Because it wasn't until about 4,500 years ago that we domesticated cows. We did it in about 2 different locations. It's kind of where the 2 breeds separated off. Somewhere in there is chickens, but chickens were a little bit hard to determine when it was that they were domesticated. But the most interesting story of all is one of the last animals that we domesticated, which was the pig. About 9,000 years ago. Now, we say about 9,000 years ago because what they think happened was that 8 separate times human beings, likely in China, figured out how to domesticate pigs, and then they weren't able to pass that on for generation and generation. You think about how big of a problem or challenge succession planning is now. Imagine if you actually lost your pigs and they went wild, right? But that's exactly what happens. And everybody in here knows how easy it can be for that to happen because it only takes 3 generations for a pig to go from domesticated to entirely feral and unrecognizable almost as a wild animal. It's good to know these stories because when you start to understand that it is possible to lose the domestication of a pig, you understand wait, we've actually done something truly amazing here, right? People in the past tried to do this over and over and over again, and imagine how dangerous it was for them to do it. But that's the tradition that you live right now. A big part of the stories that we tell ourselves is a description of who is us and who is them. Our stories let us know who's on our team and who's somebody else, an outsider, somebody that I don't know or don't trust or don't need to be participating in this world with. And I think that it's interesting when you think about how big of an impact pork had on the world was how many people defined themselves by not eating pork. Now this is particularly of interest because everybody in here has eaten ham and bacon, right? It is no small thing to ask a population of people not to eat something. Imagine if you go look at all of the cults around the world, all of the strong religious movements that have gone on, even people that are gluten-free now, right? They define themselves by what is it that we're denying ourselves. And then by denying themselves those things, they become a cluster of people that get tight together. Now, in the Old Testament, Leviticus, you guys have probably heard, one of the reasons that Jewish people can't eat pork is because of Leviticus. But have you ever actually looked at where this comes from? It's pretty interesting. So the biggest line in there is that you may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and chews the cud. There are some that only chew cud or only have a divided hoof, but those you must not eat. But it doesn't finish there. It actually goes on to give examples. The first example is a camel, right? A camel chews cud. You take a child. My daughter loves going to the zoo and just watching that camel chew on its tongue, right? But if we look at the proverbial camel toe, you see that this is not a divided hoof. And it's that right there that keeps the Jews from being able to eat camels. So that's out. Another one that's interesting, does anybody know what line comes next? Rabbits. What they say is, it turns out they think rabbits, they chew their cud, and even though they chew their cud, they don't have a divided hoof. And it took me probably better part of 2.5 hours to find that gif of a rabbit chewing its cud, which I thought was pretty clever. And if you'd be surprised, but hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of words have been written about the argument, are rabbits actually chewing cud? Because this was a real clear question about whether or not they were clean to be eaten. And then finally, of course, you have "and the pig. Though it has a divided hoof, it does not chew cud, and therefore it is unclean to you." This is interesting, right? Because think about how many people in the world didn't eat pork, something that was delicious, something that people savor over, right? Because of this part of their religion. And in fact, I wanted to put this graph up here, right? Of that group, from the Jewish all the way down to the unaffiliated, most of those people don't necessarily have an edict against eating pork, but they often are not a big part of their culture. And so in addition to the Jewish population, Muslims don't eat pork either. Now this is interesting when you consider just how much pork is eaten in the world. Right? So this graphic, it's a little hard to see maybe from in the back. You can see the percentage of all the meat that's eaten all over the world, what percentage is poultry or pig meat or beef. And one of the things that you notice here is that pig meat is a huge percentage. It's actually about 40% of all of the meat eaten all over the world is pork. Now, that's right neck and neck with poultry, right? They've been kind of edging up. This has been a big movement. But one of the funny things about this list is, while poultry has gone up, pork has not changed at all. It's been 40% of the worldwide diet for decades. And it's projected that this will keep going. And this is in large part because the Asian cultures, particularly China, has such a strong appetite for pork. And this is a very, very big part of their culture. When I was in graduate school, I studied under a Chinese scholar named Dr. Zhang Wang, and he talked about one of the most important things that the Communist Party did when they wanted to remain in power was they made it possible for people to go from eating pork maybe once or twice a year to then once or twice a month, to then once or twice a week, right? And if you've gone through that experience, if you're one of those people that used to only have meat at very, very special occasions, and now you've been able to add this into your diet over and over again, that is actually the feeling of wealth. And so it is predominantly the Chinese and the Christian populations that have eaten a large percentage of the meat in the world. Which is interesting, right? It's not an accident that for Christmas and Easter, it is so profoundly a part of the Christian tradition to have an Easter ham or a Christmas ham. And I'm going to guess this is 100%, but I'm going to take a poll here. How many of you eat a Christmas ham or an Easter ham in this room? Yeah, right. But this is actually true of people that aren't even practicing Christians anymore, people that don't even go to church around Christmas or Easter. It's so completely a part of our culture that we don't even understand that it isn't a part of other cultures. It's a big part of who we are, and yet as these stories have gone on, I'm going to stand forward. The stories that matter, the stories that you're probably thinking, I want to get better at telling, right? The stories that have an impact on people, that get them to release their grip on being upset about something, are always the stories that reveal change. You know, it's a reason why commercials are often really, really boring, right? You think about the seed, so I work for Monsanto. I would watch their seed commercials, and they were the most boring commercials in the world, right? Because the farmer would wake up, and his hair was done perfectly, and everything was good, and he got out of bed, and he went downstairs and had something perfect, and then he would leave, and he would come back, and everything was perfect throughout the entire day, right? Nothing changed, so it was completely boring, right? Stories where things don't change, we don't pay attention to. We're designed, we're primed to listen to stories to figure out, why did they have to change? Did they change fast enough? And what did that change do to them or to their community or to the future of the world? So let's talk about some change that happened along the way with pigs. It's thought one of the reasons that it took so long for pork meat to really take off as a meat was that it used to be that the only people that had pigs were people that had enough table scraps left over when they were holding sties. We're talking about around 100 BC, right? And those people, the way they fed their animals was, what scraps do we have left over? Whatever excess food can we give to these pigs so that they can have a diet and they can go on, and then maybe once or twice a year we'll slaughter a pig, we'll sell some to our neighbors, and we'll eat it ourselves. The reason that it was so difficult for it to grow as a meat was that there were no trees, or very few trees, that could produce enough material that the pigs could eat and grow fat. Things like acorns that were so important in Europe. Before you have pigs having access to that kind of a diet, they would become, they were just not big enough to be able to be driven to wherever they needed to go whenever you would pay your taxes. So it used to be, before you have a lot of cash or coinage, the way that you would pay your taxes at the end of the year, you would take a percentage of your herd and you would drive it to wherever the head of the community was. And pigs were just too thin at the time, so people didn't even account for them in their taxes. The government didn't support it, but once they move over to Europe, and now they can feed pigs, and those pigs can get really big and really juicy and can be driven. Now all of a sudden the government has a very serious interest in them, because now you can tax pigs and put them as a part of your rolls. Now, there are many, many, many ways that we could have looked at pigs. We could have looked at how they've developed through Asia or different parts of the world. But I thought, since we're all a part of the Western culture, it would be interesting to look at some of the ways that pigs moved through history. The Greeks had a very interesting relationship with pigs. So they had very few trees. They didn't have as much nutrients, just like we were saying before. It isn't until you get over to the Italian peninsula that you have enough food that you can feed pigs so they get really big. But they had them around. They were a part of their culture. But now imagine that you are a Greek soldier, right? You've just been enlisted into the Greek army. Your culture has just barely gotten out of the Bronze Age, so you have spears that will bend when they get hit, when they hit something strong, right? You don't have great weaponry, and you are now going to war with the Persians, right? So you're told, tomorrow we're going to go over that hill and we're going to go fight these Persians who are from far away. So you're getting all excited, you've got your spear, you've got your shield, and you're ready to go to battle. And that morning, when you go to climb over that hill and you now can look down and see the Persians, you see that they don't just have spears and swords and shields, they have war elephants, right? And so now the Greeks end up running in terror. They get completely bombarded in this battle, and they get overrun. And so they go back, and then that night and the next few days as they're preparing to figure out what is it that we should do to be able to fight war elephants. We don't have any elephants. How are we going to fight this? And I'm sure sitting around a fire somewhere, somebody said, you know, I went to India and I noticed that elephants are scared of two things, fire and pigs. So of course, these industrious, really well-thinking, logical Greeks, what do they decide to do? They decide to create war pigs. And so war pigs are battled out, they put armor on them, and they try and get them all worked up, and they send them over the hill. So they send these pigs down, they run down into the valley, and they were exactly right. The Persians are tossed off their war elephants, people are running scared, shattered everywhere, the Greeks win, right? Big victory. Well, it doesn't take long for the Persians to figure out, well, the way that we can get around this is when we're raising our war elephants, we'll just have them next to a pig, right? So that way they can get acclimatized to this. No big deal. So then the Greeks face this problem. Again, they now have to battle these war elephants. So then what do? Well, they think, oh, gosh, there's only two things that war elephants are afraid of, pigs and fire. Pigs and fire. They then decided that they were going to make flaming war pigs. And that is no joke what they did. The only pictures I could find of this were clearly drawn, and they were way too graphic for a family audience. But I can tell you that they put pitch on these pigs, lit them on fire, and sent them towards the Persians. And then, before it could escalate any further, the Greeks got their own war elephants, and we had a détente. No more pigs fighting. But this is a funny thing, right? Think about how long you've been in agriculture, that you've been raising pigs, and you didn't know that somewhere in some of your herds might have been deeply some ancestor of a great war hero, one of the flaming war pigs. Or maybe his cousin or something. Now, the Romans were the first culture to really embrace pork. And in fact, if you look at this graphic here, you'll notice there's the ox and the lamb and the pig. And in this sculpture, in many sculptures in Rome, when they're doing a sculpture about sacrifice, that's what all of these people are going to do, the first animal is always the most valuable. And in Roman culture, pigs became a vaulted status. They were considered, because now you have fig trees, you have acorns, you have all sorts of ways that you can feed these pigs so that they can become very large. Breeding becomes a really important part of the Roman culture. It was such a big part that when they would throw a big party, a really big party, when somebody was really rich and they wanted to throw a party for all their neighbors, what they would do is get a giant pig and then they would cook it. And then over a giant spit. But right before everybody is about to eat, the owner would go up to that pig and he would stick a knife right in the bottom where his jowl is, and he would cut the underside. And just like a piñata, all these sausages made in the shapes of pigs would fall out onto the ground, and they had been cooking inside of a pig just like a turducken, right? But this was a sign of great wealth. And it's no accident that the Italian culture has so many cured meats, so many parts of pork came out of that culture, and it's because the Romans were the very first ones to really embrace all that a pig could offer, to figure out how to do this, to spice it in certain ways, to raise different breeds. Now, one of the most important things, if you think about your culture of pigs, is to think about the adventures that those pigs have gone on, or the people that have gone raising them. We're going to skip from antiquity, the Roman era, and we're going to go all the way to the United States. how did pigs get here, right? There was one tiny wild pig that came up from South America, but by the time the Europeans got here, it was almost completely eradicated. And so when people from Europe landed in what is now the United States, there were no pigs here. So how did they get here? Well, of course, the settlers brought them, and one of the very first ones was a man named Hernando de Soto, right? So he had been an adventurer in Peru. He'd been kind of the second or third fiddle when they had gone in and raided the Incas. And what did they get from the Incas? Gold. So much gold, it was unimaginable. And so the king of Spain said, De Soto, I want you to go from Cuba, where he was hanging out, and I want you to go to Florida. And De Soto is imagining that Florida is going to be just like Peru, where there is gold everywhere. And so he takes a group of 600 men with 13 sows, and they're all pregnant when he takes them over from Cuba over into Florida. And by the time he and his men get up to southern Georgia, around where Atlanta is, that herd of pigs had grown from 13 to 300. And De Soto has traveled all throughout this land, and whenever he encounters any of the native people, he's pressuring them, he's pushing them, he's bribing them, he's doing everything he can to tell me, where is your gold? I want your gold. How can I get to it? Do any of your neighbors? How about any of your enemies? Who has gold? Well, this isn't working. So he goes for a while, and finally he decides when he's in the Atlanta area, what he's going to do is bring some of the tribal leaders together from various tribes, and he's going to take from his fatted herd of litters of pigs that he's going to cook them and share it with them. Imagine you've been living in this new world for your entire life. The fattiest thing over on that eastern part of the culture is some fish or maybe wild game like deer or other types of animals. Imagine what it would be like to have your first Spitfire ham, right? It would be the most incredible thing you've ever eaten. It would be fattier and juicier and tastier than anything any of you have ever tasted or any people for generations before you have ever tasted. So he's imagining that this is going to win favor with them. They're going to tell him where all the gold is. But it turns out that's not what happened. Because they went back to their tribes and told all the people about how great this meal was. And so they came back, and first they asked for more pigs, which they didn't give them, and then they started stealing those pigs. So they start stealing the pigs, and De Soto says, oh gosh, this is getting bad. They're killing my men. It's getting pretty ugly out there. Let's just give them part of the herd. So he gives them the herd, and then he keeps going on his trip. Takes him years to go all the way from Atlanta. He goes up to the Appalachians. He crosses down. He's just about to cross the Mississippi. He gets really, really sick. So he sends his men on to Arkansas. It's been years by the time he's here. The men in Arkansas are gone only for 2 to 3 days. And they come back, and De Soto's on his deathbed. And they start telling him with these wide eyes about how there are these crazy devil pigs all over Arkansas. They are just running around. They have giant tusks, vicious teeth, and the hair on their back is so sharp that they are, what? Razorbacks, right? And so this is how the famed Razorbacks came to be. It was De Soto and other explorers having tried to give the native populations pigs that once they broke away, 3 generations later, those pigs became completely feral and ran wild and still have a culture today. Which is funny to think about the long-term consequences of a small action back in the 1500s. Now, many of you have probably heard some story about how Manhattan is filled with greedy pigs, right? This is something everybody knows about. But it's really the story of Wall Street, right? Everybody in here kind of knows, wait, didn't they build Wall Street to keep the pigs out or something like that? Is that, most of you have heard this? So I spent weeks trying to look into this because this is an incredibly contested story. Hundreds of people have written about it. It's a very difficult story to figure out what was really going on. But what was happening was the Dutch controlled the very tip. This is a map of Manhattan. And for about 250 years, the Dutch controlled that area. It wasn't very much. It was a small group of people. It was a trading outpost. They had shipping. But they also had orchards and farms and some places where you could grow the vegetables that you needed to survive there. And so New Amsterdam is coming along, and then the British decide that they kind of like New Amsterdam, and so they start landing ships in the northern part of Manhattan. Slowly over time, they're starting to build up troops, kind of like on the Ukrainian border with Russians, right? So the man that's in charge of New Amsterdam, his name is Peter Studevant, and Peter realizes we need to build a wall there. Let's build that up. And he's got probably 2 to 3 years before the British can build an army large enough to be able to take them over. So he starts to build this wall. But what happens? Well, all the people living in New Amsterdam didn't really have great sty management practices. They didn't have containment. They used to let their pigs roam around and eat the apples that had fallen in the orchards or through the food stalls there. So now he's trying to build this fence, and he spends 3 years trying to build it, and every time he gets it up, the pigs tear it down. And so he is losing his mind, and I would put them up here, but they're very, very difficult to read because they're in Dutch, that he's writing all these letters to his mayors and to his other people in the community, begging them, please, take your pigs. We're going to kill your pigs. You've got to stop this. And it's because he knows that the British are going to overrun them if they can't build a wall. Now, it turns out the British didn't really need it. There was one small weakness in that fence, and that's that you could just kind of go around it with your troops. So it turns out that the British, without having fired a shot, were able to overtake it. But when you hear that story of Wall Street being built because of pigs, it's actually slightly more nuanced. They were trying to build it, and the pigs kept tearing it down. And then finally, another story that I thought you guys might find interesting is the tradition of drovers. So long before the cowboy became a part of the American symbol, of rugged individualism and freedom and, ability to take your life into your own hands, it was actually not, the American culture didn't have a cowboy culture. It didn't exist. There was very, very little grazing and ranching in that same way that we think of now. But they did have a history of driving pigs. And it turns out the first cultural tradition, in fact, much of the language that the cowboys later used, was created because it was far cheaper to raise corn in Tennessee, where it would grow nice and tall, and instead of trying to transport that grain to the coast where you could feed it to pigs, they would instead feed the pigs in Tennessee, make them really fat, and then drive them 10 miles a day all the way to Asheville, North Carolina. And one of the things that you can look up on a map is if you're driving from Asheville, North Carolina to Tennessee, one way or the other, there's a little town every 10 miles or so, because that's how far you could drive a pig in a single day. And that's what built up the tradition. So anytime you hear a cowboy trying to flex on you, just know that it was the drovers, the pig drivers, that created that culture. So why do I tell you these stories, right? The reason that I'm telling you these stories is because I don't know what your broccoli story will be. When you encounter a person that feels really strongly about what you're doing, or about what you need to change, or about who you are, or who pork producers are, I have no idea. And in fact, the best method for you to be able to figure out how can I reach people that don't understand what we're doing or why we're doing it or how much of a positive impact it's had on the modern world to raise pigs the way that we do, you should have these stories loaded up. And I can tell you the first 50 times I ever told the broccoli story, it fell flat on its face. But if you keep trying, if you keep giving it a shot on these various stories, whether they're ones I've told you or other stories you've heard, you can start to see the profound impact that you can have by connecting with people with stories. And that's what I believe all the way down in my heart. If you want to make a change, if you want to be able to reach out to people, you have to be able to tell a story. Now, I kind of blotted this guy's face out because he didn't give me permission to use his photo. When I'm not traveling around the country to give talks, I actually do these things called legacy interviews. This is where people that have lived a full life sit down with me and I interview them to have them tell me their family stories. People hire me to talk with their mothers or their grandmothers and hear their family values and their family stories. And a few weeks ago, I was interviewing this man right here, and he had already told us stories about losing a child, about the struggles that his marriage had had, the things and the trials and all of the things that had made his life difficult, but also made them beautiful and wonderful. The whole time he's telling me these stories, he's stoic, he's able to laugh at the lighter stuff, but can control himself during the darker, harder times. But somewhere along the line, he starts to tell a story about how he got into hog farming, because his family didn't come from hog farming. He said, you know, I was in 4-H and FFA, and I got to raise a cow. It was my dad's, and they just claimed it as mine, and it turns out it won grand champion. So I was able to sell it. And then with the money, and right at this point when he says with the money, he starts going through in his mind what happened next. With that money, I bought a litter of Yorkshires. And at this point, he starts to break down. I probably will right now. He starts to break down, and he starts to tear up about having this litter of Yorkshire pigs. And my executive producer, who's not been around agriculture at all, is completely stupefied. He's just sitting there like, what's going on here? And the man goes on to say, when I took over that litter of pigs, that was the day I became an adult. It was the day that I became in charge of something, responsible for something. Things it mattered whether I got up and took care of them in a way that nothing else ever had. It had always been my dad's, it had always been my brother's, it had always been somebody else's. And so he goes on to talk about what he did with this litter of pigs and how he grew it and how it became a herd. After we were done with the interview, my executive producer, who's Ben, he's a wonderful guy, but he has nothing to do with agriculture, he sat down next to this man and it must have asked him 100 more questions about pigs. And it was because he'd never met a person, maybe he'd met other people, certainly I'd brought people in that were pig farmers to do these interviews, but he didn't understand how deeply and closely a person could be connected to it, how the actual experience of caring for an animal to bring it all the way to market can be such a profound and meaningful experience that it would move a rather stoic man to tears. All of you have cared for animals on a level that most people living in apartments or out in the suburbs will never experience. And it's not something that you can hold over them. It's something that your stories can allow them to see. It can allow them to feel. And it can move people. And you don't really know what will happen. And then finally, the last thing is this man, anybody in here know a man named Brad Frecking from New Fashioned Pork? During COVID, all of a sudden my ability to go out and talk with large groups of people went way down, right? So I decided, because my wife was, I think, 6 months pregnant, I decided what I'm going to do is just start doing podcasts. And the beauty about doing a podcast is you can call up anyone in the world and ask them, will you sit down and talk with me? And you would not believe the amazing people you could get on, doctors and scientists and people that know about viruses and PCR. And one day, I get a call from Brad Frecking's assistant that said, Brad wants to talk to you. Would you have him on your podcast? Now, I had no idea what a pig farmer could tell me about COVID, but I thought, all right, that's going to be interesting, right? So I have Brad on, and he's a veterinarian, and he also does pig processing, so he's running a processing facility. And Brad proceeds to come on there and tell me all sorts of things that despite the fact that I grew up in central Illinois, despite the fact that I'd been in agriculture for, 7, 8 years by that point, I had no idea that he said, look, all these people calling for us to shut down the processing plants, what they don't know is there's no such thing as frozen pork just waiting on the sidelines. If we stop producing it, the shelves will go empty. I had never heard that before. No one had ever told me that. Right? It'd be very easy for you to be a person living in the city thinking you're doing good by saying, hey, don't make those workers go into work. We don't want that. We want them to be safe, not realizing that you will potentially put in danger 40% of the meat that's around that people eat in the United States and around the world. Another thing he goes on to say, he says, pig farmers have been dealing with herd management, how to deal with issues, how to isolate for hundreds of years. We know all kinds of things about this, and it turns out Brad Freching had gotten his hands on PCR tests for his workers. He knew more at the time of this podcast than the CDC or any other group was putting out there about asymptomatic cases, when somebody would get positive, how quickly it would spread. Now, the reason I bring this up is we all know, every person in this room knows, we're in a perilous position in the world right now. Supply chains are weird. There's all this talk about whether or not the COVID will be a big deal, or what the Russians will do, or what will happen in Taiwan. And it may be easy for you to think about yourselves as, hey, I'm just raising pigs in the state of Iowa, the state that raises the most pigs in the United States, right? I'm just doing my thing. I don't need to pay attention to this, or I don't need to include myself on this. But I can assure you, you know things about supply chain and about the way the world works that almost no one else knows. And there's going to come a time when you need to put your ideas out into the world. Maybe it's something as simple as writing a Facebook post about what you know about the supply chain, or what you know about how important the meat is to the world. Maybe it'll be something larger. Maybe somebody will invite you to be on a podcast. Maybe you'll invite yourself to be on a podcast. But I can tell you that that was the largest downloaded podcast I had ever done, by an order of many, many magnitudes. Hundreds of thousands of people listened to that interview, and most of them not farmers. And all Brad did was sit on there and tell me stories. So as we close, I want you to think about the future and your power as a person that is doing something that is extremely rare. There are very few rooms, not just in the United States, but anywhere in the world, of people like you. You know things, and you have a history and a tradition that is profoundly important and a deep part of American culture. And so feel empowered to go out and tell stories about what you do and why you do it, because you have no idea how big of an impact it'll have on the world. So thank you so much for inviting me to come to speak today. So we have time for questions. Sometimes people like to hear about the crazy stories that happened at Monsanto, or we can talk about stories and where they go, or anything else. Any questions? Yes?
Vance, tell us about any of the interactions or altercations you may have had with the animal activist groups that might be against our industry, and how you responded to that.
Well, since we're in Iowa, I got a good one. So when I first took the job, Director of Millennial Engagement, I had 6 months where all I did was learn, right? All I did was go out. And at the time, I was invited by a graduate program at Iowa State University in the ag program to come and talk. This is going to be great, right? So at the time, the PR firm that Monsanto had hired, because they were trying to go through this big revamp. They wanted to change their image, so they hired a PR firm. They did things like hire a director of millennial engagement. And so the PR firm said, hey, when you go, just use these slides. We've already tested them with audiences. We've already gotten them past legal. Just use these slides. And I thought, okay, great, that'll work. And so just as I'm walking into the room at Iowa State, I call up my friend that actually helped me decide to take the job. And he said, Vance, if you can't win over the ag kids at Iowa State University, you should quit your job, right? So I walk in there thinking, all right, this is going to be good, right? So I walk in there, and as soon as I do, it's the stadium-style seating. As soon as I get in there, I'm like, these kids don't look like ag students, but okay. So I go through, and I'm thinking, hey, it's a 2-hour lecture. What I really want to do is get to Q&A. That's what'll be fun, right? I can tell them all these things I've learned about GMOs. So I take this PowerPoint presentation, and what should have taken 2 hours, I did in 15 minutes. Bang, 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 bang. GMOs are good for the world. We know we need pesticides, blah, 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 blah. Right? So I get done with my whole presentation, and there's 1 hour and 45 minutes left, and I'm thinking, I'm going to get to just bask in the excitement of asking questions. And so I say, are there any questions? and which is why I'm always nervous even when I ask a group like this. And so I said, are there any questions? And a woman all the way in the back raised her hand straight up in the air. So she's up in the air, and I said, yes, you there, do you have a question? And she says, I don't believe a word out of your mouth. And the whole crowd broke into laughter and clapping. And that was when I realized those weren't the ag kids I knew, right? It turns out there is a sustainable ag program at Iowa State University that has broken away from the ag school and floated to the left side of campus. I don't know if you guys know this. But they were running a sustainable ag program, and they literally spent months and months and months talking about how evil Monsanto was, and then they invited him in to come in and talk with them, and I had no idea what to do. So ask yourself what you would do, right? What would you do? The door's over there, and you've got 200 people, right? And so what I did was I didn't know what to do, so I had to try and buy time. So what I did was I looked around the room, and I realized there was a chalkboard on there. And so I go to the chalkboard and I said, okay, do you have any specific questions that you don't believe me about? And she says, yes. And many of the things I had asked in my interview, Indian farmer suicides, GMOs, these kinds of things. And so what I did was I wrote down every one of her questions in as high fidelity as I could. So now we're not arguing over, am I answering her question? I get it down and she knows, and you can see the room kind of ratchet down in excitement. And then I still don't know what to do. So I look around and I see there's a stool. So I go and I take the stool and I set it in the center of the room and I sit down on it and I say, look, I am really well trained in PR and I can go through these questions, bang, 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 and I can answer them one at a time. But if I do that, I'm going to feel defensive and you guys are not going to believe anything I'm saying here. So how about this? Do you have other questions? And they were like, yes. So I was like, why don't we take them one at a time? And I'll tell you whatever I've heard, right? I don't know. These are just what I know. This is your one chance to ask a guy, and I'll give you as best as I can. And so when we get done, if I haven't answered all of the questions on the board, then I won't leave until I get them, until I answer them. And so that's what we did. For the next hour and 45 minutes, they asked me the hardest questions they could think of, including, are GMOs what caused my son's autism? And I answered them as best I could. And by the time we were done, they invited me out for beers, and then we went and hung out, and it was pretty fun, actually. But I think the moral of that story is, with animal activists, you're talking about people that have been ideologically indoctrinated, right? They have a truth in their minds that everyone else must believe, and they are intransigent. They won't stop until they convince other people. And the only way that you can diffuse any of that is to make it so they are very clear that you've heard them. Writing that down is what they call in counseling mirroring. You're making sure they know that you know everything that they think. And once that's down, you'll watch emotion go way down in a conversation, and suddenly you can slow things down. And that's the problem with animal activists, is that until you can get people to bring the emotion down, there's no point in engaging. Yes? That was a recent podcast, yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Can you just touch on any of that?
So I have a podcast called the Vance Crowe podcast, because when you have a weird name like Vance Crowe, it's just easier to do it that way. And what I do is I try and interview people that I consider to be up the graph. And what I mean by that is, where are there ideas that are really valuable to know, but very, very few people know about them? Eventually, those ideas will spread out into society and they'll become well known, or some of them will die off and nobody will know anything about them. So I go and talk to people that I don't necessarily agree with, that I don't even necessarily like sometimes. Most of the time, by the time we're done, I like them. But I try and find people that are talking about things that other people, that you can't find in other places. And the man you're referring to, I actually did like. His name is Zach Stein, and he works with a thing called the Consilience Project. And what they're trying to do is to figure out how to break people awake from the fact that, it's a little bit long of a story, but his hypothesis is that when we were entering the Cold War and we had just invented nuclear weapons, at the same time we were figuring out how to do psychological war. We were starting to figure out, how do you get blue jeans and rock and roll to infiltrate the Russians? How do you broadcast that into them? How do you get them to start to break away from their way of thinking? And then what he says is, when the Cold War ended, we had all these capabilities, and we needed to point it somewhere, and so a lot of that got pointed at ourselves. Our own government started saying, hey, we can do campaigns that get people to go through vaccinations or do other public health campaigns, and then it grows and it grows and it grows. Advertising ends up using it. And what he ends up talking about is there is so much information pointed at us that is not designed to teach you how to think. It teaches you what to think. And that, at its core, is the difference between propaganda and education. Education is how to think. How do I resolve this problem for myself? I try and tell you stories and then say, you should take these stories and build on them, right? But people that are doing propaganda are telling you, this is what you should think, which is what many, you were talking about animal activists, right? Somebody handed them those ideas. They didn't arrive at those on their own. And so he tries to divine that. So that's an example of one of the podcasts that I've had on recently. I would encourage you to check it out. It's a good podcast. Yes?
So who are your favorite storytellers and influencers right now?
So in agriculture or in general?
In agriculture and beyond agriculture, across the spectrum.
In agriculture, there is a guy right now that goes by the name Quick Dick McDick. Anybody in here ever heard of him? Quick Dick is hilarious. He is a guy that worked on an oil farms or oil fields, decided he didn't want to do it anymore, came back home, started working on the farm, and now he makes videos about him. They're hilarious. Some of them are about Canadian issues. I think he is an excellent example of somebody that was willing to try things and be embarrassed when he first started, and now has really made a big impact. His videos get to people that are way outside of agriculture. The most interesting, thought-provoking person in the world right now, as far as I'm concerned, is a man named Joscha Bach, Joscha, Bach, B-A-C-H. I've interviewed him twice on my podcast. He is a German philosopher that studies artificial intelligence. And why he's so interesting is he's working on how do you get computers to think like human beings? Well, if you want to do that, you first have to deeply understand how is it that human beings think? How do they know what they know? And so he talks about things like some of our origin stories, right? Like, what is the value of the story of the Garden of Eden in the Bible? Or why he just has a very interesting and profound way of thinking about things. And I would highly recommend. I think he is an extremely brilliant person. And even if you disagree with his ideas, the way that he puts them is so compelling that you have to listen, right?
How do I spell his last name?
Bach, B-A-C-H. And if you're a Twitter follower, actually, he's at P-L-I-N-Z, Plins. And I'm telling you, that is the best Twitter follow. You'll never have a better one than that. I really like Joscha Bach. Other questions? I would also say Lexi over there is really good on social media. This is one of the first times I've ever been at a conference and recognized somebody I follow. So Lexi is quite good on Instagram. Lexi Merrick? M-A-R-E-K. Lexi's good too. Any other questions?
Do you have any ideas of how to unify there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of great things on Instagram and Facebook and things along those lines, whether it's pork or beef or dairy, whatever, but are there ways for us to be able to unify so that we're sending a really good, strong message? Are there things that you are maybe aware of that maybe we aren't?
So I'm going to give you an answer that's the opposite of what I think you're asking about. When I was at Monsanto, there was a big pressure for us to all get on the same page and tell the same story. But if we think about the most powerful force on Earth that we know of is evolution, natural selection, right? And it is, what is it that survives if you put it out in the wild that replicates faster than everything else? And I think one of the challenges that ag has felt with is you're like, hey, look, I'm trying to do pork production. I don't have time to be doing this and this and this. And so the easy answer is, well, let's just consolidate it all. We'll come up with a really good story and we'll use that one, right? But the activists don't do that. The activists are all independent actors, right? They're all entrepreneurs, and they're all trying to get their ideas to spread faster. So they're trying all these different things. And then when one hits, Bing, then they all start replicating it. That story of the Matrix, once they figured that pattern out, they started doing it over and over and over and over again. If you want to read a really interesting book about how they do it, it's called Story Wars by Jonas Sachs. Now, what I believe is, if you're a creative person, you should try and do what Quick Dick McDick does, and you should try and create things, try and do new things, the story of broccoli kind of thing. If you're not a creative person, and that's okay, we've kind of like created this part of our culture where we say everybody needs to be creative. That's not true. If you're not a creative person, then finding what other people have done well and replicating that is a way of propagating those ideas. I believe we should be going more towards, and I know there's people in here that are trying to push everybody together, but my belief is decentralize. Try as many things as you can, and this is where your weird nephew that doesn't do anything right on the farm, but he knows how to make drone videos, that's how he becomes really valuable, because he's willing to do weird things, right? So my belief is try and decentralize, and when you find something that's valuable, replicate the hell out of it and try and get other people to as well.